Rock gardens used to be a key element in the British garden, even if you had quite a small suburban garden. And that's partly because, of course, they're a brilliant way of dealing with any kind of a slope or bank, if you've got one. And also they became very fashionable in Edwardian times, and fashions tend to sort of filter down until things are found in every garden. But of course, when something gets too popular, we get bored of it. And also it leads to neglected areas and people just thinking, what's this? You know, it really isn't special at all. So since about the 1970s, the rock garden has pretty much disappeared from the garden designer's palette. But a few years ago, garden centres started reporting an increase in sales in rocks and pebbles, and the media started talking about a rockery revival. And I started to see rock garden elements appear in show gardens, not necessarily whole rock gardens, but elements of rock gardens, for example, as this one in the Woodland Garden by Davis and White with the Duchess of Cambridge in a Chelsea flower show a few years ago. Or this one, where the rock garden principles are almost used to create a border, because the rock garden doesn't have to be a whole big area of your garden, it can just be a small area. So to find out more about rock gardens and how you can adapt them to your garden, I went to Doddington Place Gardens to talk to Amicia Oldfield. And Doddington Place Gardens has got a rock garden created in the classic Edwardian era of rock gardens. And it was renovated about 15 years ago. And although it's a big rock garden, there are certainly tips that you can take from it for your own garden. And I also went to visit garden designer Posy Gentles, who had been given some rocks and has turned a part of her typical narrow town garden into a rock garden area. It's Alexandra here from the Middle-Sized Garden YouTube channel and blog, and I'll put links to Doddington Place Gardens and to Posy Gentles' garden design in the description below. And if you're new here, the Middle-Sized Garden uploads weekly with tips, ideas and inspiration for your garden. So if you'd like to see the videos when you open up YouTube, tap subscribe. So where would you place your rock garden? Well, obviously it's a typical thing for a bank or a slope. But of course, if you don't have a bank or slope, what do you do? Well, the Royal Horticultural Society says that you can kind of create a bank or slope with rocks or bricks or rubble. And of course, that might be quite useful for people in a new build house because quite often there's a lot of rubble left in their garden. And once you've created that bank, the RHS suggests you put upturned turves on the top because that stops the soil from going right down. You'd need to put an awful lot of soil on a pile of rocks or rubble. It would all sort of slip down, whereas if you put the upturned turves on it and then cover it with the soil, and then you put the rocks in, and then you plant in it, and then you add a gravel or shingle or pebble or shell mulch. And the reason for adding the mulch is that a rock garden drains very well. Anything on a slope drains very well. So you have to choose drought tolerant plants, and also a mulch will help stop water evaporating. You can either place the rocks very close together as if they were in a naturally exposed mountainside, or you can have them quite far apart with shingle or pebble or gravel in between. Should you use a weed suppressant membrane? I belong to a few professional gardener Facebook groups where people discuss sort of problems and issues and solutions amongst themselves. And recently someone went online and said that they were doing a rockery for a client and the client wanted them to use a weed suppressant membrane, and should they? And everyone said no. And that's unusual. And that's because weed suppressant membranes really only suppress weeds for a few months. Weeds will land on top or escape underneath, and also they ruck up and they look ugly. But to decide how to create your rock garden, I think it's really helpful to know something about how the history of the great rock gardens established, and really to have a look at one of the great rock gardens. So I asked Amicia what tips there were in her rock garden for our smaller gardens, and to tell us a bit about the rock garden at Doddington Place Gardens. How does this rock garden fit in? What's the history of this rock garden?
When the house was bought from the Croft family, Croft Portacherry, by my husband's family, just before the First World War, the woman who bought it, who's still known as Aunt Maud, she did lots of improvements. She made the house a bit bigger. She put in this rock garden. Rock gardens were very fashionable just before the First World War. And also there's another garden quite near here called Mount Ephraim, and they were putting in a rock garden, and I don't know if they were vying with each other or whatever, but they were both doing it at around the same time. And the story is that the stone came from a quarry near Maidstone, and came on the train, and I'm not sure this is true, and then came by steam engine up here.
Not many people have got that size of a rock garden, but there's lessons here which actually we can pick up for very small rock gardens.
Yeah.
And I think one of those is the stone, which is the stone needs to be quite local, doesn't it, for it to look good?
Yes, for it to look right in the environment. This stone is ragstone. It's Kentish ragstone, which you see some houses are built of Kentish ragstone. I think great houses like Penshurst and Knoll are Kentish ragstone. Otherwise, if you imported a different stone, it would look really out of place, wouldn't it?
Was there any actual rock here, do you think, before? Or?
No, because we're on the high on the North Downs here. It's very chalky, so you can't. Perhaps you can see here there are bits of chalk, but if you dig down just below the surface, there's endless chalk here.
So, how big is this rock garden?
Well, I'm not absolutely sure, but I think it's getting on for half an acre, which of course is far too big for almost the whole population of England. But what you could take home from a visit here is just a little section of it that you want to replicate in your garden.
I know that around 20 years ago, the rock garden had got quite overgrown and quite neglected, and you decided that you needed to renovate it. So in order to renovate a rock garden, what were the factors you had to take into account?
Well, we thought the soil was very tired. We thought the whole thing was fantastically overgrown. It had a marvellous atmosphere of its kind, but it couldn't go on like that because it was being encroached by nature, really. Nature was taking over. So we had to do something quite radical to it all. So we took all the rocks out, which is rather dramatic. And then we did add a few new rocks. It was all done by someone called Mac Jackson, who'd just done the quarry garden at Scotney Castle. And he was an avid climber, a mountain climber. So it was very apposite that he did the rock garden, because he had an intuitive understanding of how rocks work and how to put them together.
So it's a good idea to research what rocks would be native in your particular landscape. But of course, buying rocks is expensive. Garden designer Posy Gentles was actually given some rocks, and that is worth remembering, because if someone is clearing something like rocks from their garden, they would have to pay to have them taken away. So quite often they are happy to give them away. So I'll go over to Posy Gentles and talk to her about how she created her rock garden area in her small town garden.
You can go and buy rocks like this at sort of several pounds each, which is quite an expensive way to do it. But you can also look on things like Gumtree and Facebook Marketplace, and sometimes people just have a pile of stuff they want to get rid of if you go and take it away for them. So I'd recommend looking at that. And you can also use things like old bricks, because I used to work in a garden which had a big pile of bricks that they had meant to move. And in the end, lots of things self-sowed all over it, so it was covered in digitalis, ferruginea and euphorbias, and it was actually really beautiful.
So what about planting a rock garden? Well, the essential principles are that it should mimic something like an alpine mountain, because that's where the inspiration came from. And typically plants on an alpine mountain were quite small and compact, because obviously they had to deal with quite harsh conditions and strong winds, and that tends to make plants smaller. Alpine plants typically have got bright jewel colours, and they're very distinctive and they're quite small. And of course, a rock garden is a very good place to show off smaller plants. You can find usually an alpine plant section in garden centres near you, or go online to find alpine plant specialists, and of course they'll be able to give you advice. But when you're planning it, start with the evergreen structure, because you do want to have something to look at in winter. And that can be either low-growing evergreen shrubs, such as hebes, and it's worth including some vertical structure as well, such as miniature conifers. And then, of course, because rock gardens are all about vertical space, you'll need some trailing plants that go down as well as plants that go up. And so that can be things like prostate rosemary, creeping thyme, or aubrietia, all classic rock garden plants. And of course, rock gardens are a wonderful way of displaying bulbs. Many of the bulbs that we grow in our gardens, such as narcissi and tulips, evolved from mountain-dwelling species. So wild tulips and wild narcissi are a great choice for rock gardens, but you can also plant the ordinary bulbs as well. What is brilliant is that these very small plants, instead of being on the ground, they're raised up a bit, so you can really enjoy them. When you were replanting this rock garden, what kind of plants did you focus on?
This rock garden is a good lesson for people in this searing heat we've just had. The plants have now been in here for 13, 14 years, and we've never had to water in here. And we've hardly lost anything. The things that we have lost, we lost through the beast from the east. Remember that snow spell? So we've gone for plants that are used to very hot climates because that suits this rock garden, and it's paid off because we couldn't begin to water this. The rest of the garden's been a great struggle to keep everything going, but we, as I said, we haven't had to water in here at all.
So in fact, rock gardens could be coming back really as a kind of drought-resistant planting.
Well, they would be rather sensible, yes. The only thing is there's quite a lot of weeding. I'm sitting here, I can see weeds, but yes, if you have things like cistus and lavender and yuccas, well, the yuccas are very old. The yuccas were always here.
And you've said weeding, so would you say that they do need a fair amount of maintenance, rock gardens?
Well, they need a fair amount of weeding, but of course most rock gardens aren't on this scale. I mean, this scale's bonkers, but because we've got it, and we do have to weed in it. But it is pretty labour intensive. Yeah.
And so what other plants have done really well in this rock garden?
Well, the lavender's done very well, of course. Phlomis has done a bit too well. It's a bit of a thug, it goes everywhere. Euphorbias do well in here. We've got some hebes, they've done quite well in here, which is surprising because I rather associate hebes with the west coast of Scotland where it's very wet always. The ferns have self-sown themselves everywhere.
And you were saying also rock roses?
They have done well, and they look as if they come from a hot country, don't they? So they look very good. And they also spill over the rocks, making it softer and more romantic. Because you don't want everything to be too rigid in a rock garden. It's got to look as if it's been put there by nature, not by human hands.
And I've also noticed there's quite a lot of moss on your rocks, and personally I love moss in gardens and I can't understand why there's so many products trying to kill it. But presumably in a rock garden you'd encourage, or you certainly wouldn't remove moss?
Oh no, I well, like you, I actually love moss and I wouldn't do it. And you only get moss after a time, but that's what I like about it, the patina of the stone, of all the moss and all the various things like that, yes.
And have you put much sculpture in here or anything like that, or have you kept it just rocks?
No, we've just had rocks. No
Which
sculpture.
I think is quite good, because the rocks almost are sculptural themselves,
Yes,
really, aren't they?
true,
And it would
yeah.
perhaps be too
I
much.
don't think you need that. I think that's over egging it, over gilding it. You don't. If you should just rejoice in the beauty of the rocks and the plants.
And is there any other advice you'd give for somebody thinking of putting a rock garden into their kind of really probably quite small or middle-sized garden?
What the advice I'd give is I would first of all go and look at some other rock gardens. I did that. I went up to Yorkshire and looked at a couple of rock gardens there before I did this. And perhaps go to a specialist plant nursery who specialise in alpines, of which there are quite a few, and just make a list of what you like before you just randomly go out and get things. And just draw a little plan. I think planning a little rock garden, which should be a little jewel in your garden, I think it's very important to try and get it right from the start, because it's so small, it's very possible straight away to get it right. Whereas a border, even if it's only 2 foot by 3 foot, that's more testing.
A rock garden has been an essential ingredient in the typical English country garden. So if you're interested in other aspects of how to achieve the English country garden look, I'll put the English country garden style video at the end of this video. And do you think you'll be incorporating some kind of rock garden into your gardens? And thank you for watching. Goodbye.